Jim Zachary. I'm the president of the First Amendment Foundation. We really appreciate you showing up for this early morning event. We just have a few words of thanks that we want to express, and we're going to turn it over to our very distinguished panel. First, we want to thank the Georgia State University College of Law, to our student organization co-sponsors, the American Constitution Society. I saw Sam Welty earlier. Where are you at, Sam? Thank you. He's here representing them, and we appreciate your organization and all that you guys do to support us. And Alexis Herring is here with us, and she's back there in the back representing the Black Law Students Association. And once again, we very much appreciate your support for our efforts. I don't see any Georgia Recorder folks here. Are there? Yeah, there's somebody I know well and overlooked. So Georgia Recorder was very gracious in supplying your breakfast and your coffee, and we really appreciate them for supporting our efforts here and actually kind of welcoming them to the Georgia journalism community. So really this is all about the First Amendment. It's all about public access and a very, very distinguished panel. And I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Peter Canfield, who is one of the top First Amendment lawyers in the state and in the country, and we're very fortunate to have him as part of our organization, and it's all yours.
Thank you, Jim, and hello, everyone, and thank you for being here. We have a number of topics that we've set the stage for discussion. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into the full bios of all our panelists. I'm just going to introduce them briefly. I believe you've got program information in which you can learn more about them. To my immediate left, State Senator Jen Jordan is chair of the Senate Special Judiciary Committee. She's on the front lines of the legislative issues we will discuss today. To her left is James Salzer, who's a reporter and editor at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. He's covered the Georgia General Assembly, state government, and politics since 1990. I think he can tell you at any minute of the day exactly how much time is left in the current session. To his left is Tom Clyde, who's an attorney with Kilpatrick Stockton, who represents media clients on a variety of First Amendment issues and chairs the legal committee of the Georgia First Amendment Foundation, which follows legislative issues through the year. To his left, we have State Representative Josh McLaurin. He's a member of the House Judiciary Non-Civil Committee, which has jurisdiction over Georgia's criminal code and procedure and weighs in on legislation that carries the possibility for criminal penalties. And I'm not sure we are missing from our panel today, and we hope she may arrive and join us, Cobb County Commissioner Lisa Cupid, who deals with government transparency issues at the local level every day and is also a Georgia State alum. But let's get started with questions. We're going to go through a number of topics here and then come back for any questions that you all have in the audience, or if there are any other issues that you'd like our panel to weigh in on. I'm going to start with Representative McLaurin. Senate Bill 288 is the latest in a number of criminal justice reform measures in Georgia. It in particular would amend and broaden Georgia's criminal record expungement law to restrict access to criminal history information under certain circumstances. A number of news organizations and members of the public and the foundation are concerned about the implication for this for public transparency, particularly in the law enforcement issues. Representative, what's your take on this bill?
Thank you, Peter, and thanks to the Georgia First Amendment Foundation for having me today. I'm excited to be here. These are issues that are close to my heart, and I'm just singing that song to tee up the drama I want to start when I'm contrarian about this particular issue. The record restriction issue is tough. I was just having a conversation a minute ago about how, we go through this rigmarole of we pass laws that create criminal liability, and then somebody gets accused of a crime. We write it down, we make a record of it, and then we're like, just kidding, you can't look at it. We're restricting it. And it seems like part of the issue that we have here with the whole concept of record restriction is that we need to decide what we want to do with a record, right? We need to decide what the purpose of a criminal record is. And Georgia has, in particular, an issue with criminal records interfering with the livelihoods of the people who live here. I think it's something like 4 million people plus have a criminal record in the state of Georgia, over a third of the population. And that's a significant barrier, it can be, to housing, education, and employment. And so I think it's for misdemeanors, I think the rule is you have to consent. And obviously when you apply for a job or you apply to get an apartment, you'll offer your consent for your background check to be taken, right? And for felonies, you don't have to give that consent. There's a public database, current law, of felony records which you can search. Now the issue, and I think this is what the bill's trying to address, is let's say that you are accused of a felony, or you're arrested for a felony, right? And ultimately you're convicted of a lesser included offense. I know, for example, I'll tell you a personal story. In Virginia, now this is not a felony, but it's a Class A misdemeanor. If you speed in Virginia, by the way, don't. It's a reckless driving charge if you're going 81 in an 80, okay? So all of you on the connector, be warned if you're in Virginia. And what they do, typically, it's a cash cow. They will reduce the reckless down to like a defective equipment or something, which is what I was ultimately convicted of. And so something like this, maybe a pretty common arrangement in some jurisdictions that are used to charging things up and then eventually only convicting you of something smaller. Now, in that case, it's not a lesser included, but that's just one example of how you might have a felony arrest record that ultimately doesn't materialize into a felony conviction. Okay, and so in those cases, that felony arrest is sticky, and you can still find that record despite the fact that you were ultimately never convicted of a felony. So this bill, 288, and I haven't spoken with Senator Anderson about the bill, so I don't really know what her intentions were exactly, or exactly how she tried to tailor the language. But my guess is that she was trying to streamline the availability of records such that basically it's one for one. If you get convicted, the record's available. If you don't get convicted, the record's not available. Because right now we have this patchwork. In fact, it might surprise you to learn under current law that a jury can acquit you of a crime, but there's a special procedure by which I believe it's prosecutor can petition to keep the records on the books, and they can make an argument that's basically tantamount to, well, we would have won if it weren't for this suppressed evidence, right? For example. So, basically this whole body of case law on the Fourth Amendment is bearing on this question of whether, a prosecutor can petition to keep something on the books. So again, it goes back to this question of what do we want a record to accomplish? And in my mind, and I haven't taken a position on 288, but specifically, and there are lots of organizations who are doing good work on this issue to try to figure out, again, what we want a record to accomplish, what types of barriers should be there, because I think, again, the public interest in knowing about an arrest record or a conviction is that there's a public safety concern. I mean, if you're working with kids and you're applying for a job where you are around children a lot, it's obviously extremely pertinent information if you have any criminal history that relates to crimes against children, for example. I mean, that's just one easy example. So my thought is, let's have a conversation as a society, as a legislature, about what we think these records should do. And I think once we know what our values are in that regard, the rest is kind of downhill.
Thank you. Any response to that? Any further comment from anyone else on the panel?
So with respect to that, I agree with Josh, but I do think that probably Senator Anderson's point was to start the conversation. And that's kind of what the process is down at the General Assembly a lot of the time. Before I was elected, I thought that kind of like somebody introduced a bill and then it becomes a law. That's really not what it is. And a lot of times it is about having this very public conversation and bringing in experts to say, yeah, it seems like a good idea, but there are some unintended consequences here that we need to be really careful about. And that's actually how good legislation eventually comes out, if that process actually takes hold. But I think we all know that an arrest, I mean, if you're arrested and then your employer finds out about it, I mean, and we're not talking about speeding or whatever, I mean, you're probably not going to get the job, even if you weren't doing anything wrong. And so it's one of those things where what we're seeing is we're seeing so many people in this state that are being prejudiced by, accusations or allegations that eventually are debunked or don't hold up. And we have to ask ourselves, is that fair? I mean, we don't know who was the arresting officer. What were the circumstances? Was there evidence? Was there not? Was this person being targeted? And so I think we know that it always has to be about a balance. And I know that's not anything anybody ever wants to really acknowledge, because we want it to be so black and white, but it really is a balance between what the public really needs to know, like if there's somebody working with children, versus what we just kind of want to know, and then the impact on each of us, because it could happen to any of us, and that's what we really need to understand.
And just along the lines of evolving the conversation, I do think the conversation needs to evolve, because one of the problems with expungement right now is that it not only takes measures that protect that individual, but it takes measures that actually seal a whole array of records in the court system and in the police system. And so the net effect of that is the entire activity by police and prosecutors ends up sealed and hidden away from the public. So even in situations where the media isn't per se interested in the name of the individual whose records are sealed, they not only can't see the name, they can't see the records of what happened, what the decisions that law enforcement made, the decisions that prosecutors in the case made. All the records get sealed. And so let me just explain that in a little more detail. When, under the current expungement system, and are essentially over the last 5-6 years, expungement has gotten broader and broader and broader in the state of Georgia. When records get expunged, and now an array of criminal records get expunged automatically almost, you lose access, the public can no longer get access to the arrest records that are maintained by law and by police. You can no longer get access to the records in the court system because those get sealed. And you can no longer get access to the records that are maintained by GBI as part of their criminal database. And so the net effect of that is, over time, expungement ends up concealing large amounts of what law enforcement is doing. And in a democratic society, one of the most important roles of the media and one of the most important roles of the public is to scrutinize the aspects, the conduct of law enforcement. If law enforcement is charging people with felonies and then downshifting those felonies as a routine matter to more minor crimes as a revenue source, that's wrong. But expungement ends up concealing that in a systematic way. So I think there's a lot of benefits to expungement. I think everybody acknowledges that, but we've got to try and fine-tune it in a way that still allows the media and the public to scrutinize, at a minimum, the conduct of law enforcement.
Thank you. And we can come back to that during the question and answer period at the end, but let me turn to something else. I mean, one very public conversation this past year has been about the stereogenics controversy, the emissions in Cobb County and elsewhere in the state from similar plants. I'm going to ask Senator Jordan, who has a large Cobb County constituency, to ask, has that very public conversation, is it headed to the General Assembly in any way? Did transparency work the way it should have there, or is Is there anything that we need to be concerned about, or is it just a matter of citizens need to pay more attention to government records that exist?
So with respect to did transparency work? No. And is there a problem? And that's yes. For those of you who aren't familiar, there is a medical sterilization plant in Cobb County right on the Chattahoochee called Sterigenics. And they use a compound called ethylene oxide. And basically the ethylene oxide is pumped into a room and it basically permeates the membrane of like plastic bags into medical equipment. I mean, you can imagine with skin, if it can do it to plastic, gets in there, sterilizes catheters and the like. It is necessary in a lot of ways because it's medical equipment. And I think we all want catheters to be sterilized before they're used in a hospital setting. The problem is that ETO has been shown very directly to be a carcinogen that causes very specific types of cancers, including breast cancer, different leukemias, that kind of thing. For years, this plant was operating and no one really knew it was there because ETO isn't noxious, you don't see it. And thanks to the good work of reporters, honestly, it was discovered. And it came out after an Open Records Act request from Andy Miller and Brenda Goodman. And what they discovered was that the EPA had contacted Georgia State EPD and said, ooh, there's some bad numbers here. You know, these levels of ETO are really high, and it's concerning from a public health standpoint in terms of causing cancer if people live in this area. EPD basically just said, okay, this was when Governor Deal was in office, didn't tell Governor Deal, didn't tell that administration. Governor Kemp's administration came in. We've been told that none of this was communicated to Governor Kemp's administration, that no one in the government knew about this except for Georgia EPD, who basically just kind of kept it in-house and said, you know, thanks, but no thanks. We're not really going to tell anybody about this. And so after the ORR that Brenda sent out, and they got thousands and thousands of pages from Georgia State EPD, they discovered kind of these email chains and kind of this very intentional decision not to tell the public, not to tell people, and really not to do anything about it. And so I think that it was a huge win for the First Amendment and for journalism in terms of what exactly journalism is supposed to do. I think it shows a real problem in terms of our state government transparency, and really folks that work for us as a body politic understanding exactly what their jobs are. So I don't know if that answers the question.
No, I think so. Any comment on that from anyone?
It is pretty amazing that I also have not seen a lot of reaction in the legislature or in the administration to say we need to do something at EPD about this, about them not putting this out. There's been some talk of that, but you would think the legislature, the governor's office, or whatever, would react much more strongly to them doing it. But
Yes.
it's you know, in truth, a lot of agencies have information like that. We've done a number of we just did a series on care homes where Department of Community Health, the person who was regulating them, would not talk to our reporters, and when our reporters went to talk to them, they pretended they were. The reporter introduced herself to this person, and the person just walked by, would not even want to talk to us, even though they knew we were doing this investigation. We've been doing it for a long time. That's not completely uncommon. I've done open records requests where it was months and months for information that I knew was at the was at a click of somebody's computer. So.
Well, and James, maybe that's a good segue to talk about what action was proposed, at least in the end of the last session, with respect to journalists in the General Assembly. Do you want to give us that background?
Representative Andy Welch and I don't remember, 4 or 5 other House members sponsored a bill that would regulate journalists, would essentially create a panel that would come up with a set of rules for journalists and would essentially register them. It's a bill that's not. I don't know that he even thought it would ever really go anywhere, but it obviously caused a lot of consternation and garnered him international press for the idea. But it was. I had a conversation with him about 2 or 3 days before he filed it, and he was asking about what rules there were for journalists and ethics and that kind of stuff. And I commented that I thought it was interesting that he wanted to consider this idea, considering that the General Assembly does not follow the Open Records Act themselves, is not always very transparent themselves. So, but anyways, he told me a story about how an interview he had just done, and he was wondering about the ethics of the reporter that was asking questions and their angle and bias. And so after he filed this bill and I wrote about it, I called other legislators who were co-sponsoring the bill, and they all told me stories about being mad about 1 or 2 incidents of dealing with the media, and they didn't like the way it was handled. So it seemed kind of a superficial reason to try to go against not go against, but to take legal restrictions against First Amendment. So
This also, by the way, came after some pretty extensive reporting by the AJC that was negative as to the Speaker of the House. And then this bill was filed. So
I don't have any indication. I mean, that has been raised, but I don't have any indication.
it's more of a timeline thing.
It is.
For me.
It is. It's coincidence, right?
It's very coincidental, we'll say. But it was a little disappointing because Representative Welch is an attorney.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I mean, he knows. He knows.
He knows better.
He knows where it's going to go. But it is still. And some of the things we talked about. There are some interesting issues involving, particularly, not just at the Capitol, at the coverage of Congress, of who the evolving question of who is the media and who are journalists, people who portray themselves as journalists that are opinionators more than anything. So, I mean, I understand some of the issues he raises, but not sure that's the best way to do it.
One broader point about how bills get introduced to the General Assembly, my joke about it is if you see a bill that you're just like, where did this come from? I mean, what is this person thinking? I think the question you got to ask is who hurt you, right? It's like, it's this whole, like, every weird bill comes from a personal story that a legislator personally experienced. And, that's why businesses, that know they're dealing with a legislator and say, oh, well, we're not going to pay you your fee, refund your fee. Like, that's probably not smart. And just in the sense that you're just cooking up trouble that you don't need to be because somebody will lash out like this. Now, I would hope never to do that, but I think that some people feel like they need to make a statement, like you say, that
Right.
they don't even know if it's going to go anywhere, but they just want to flex a little bit and say, I've heard more than a couple legislators say, yeah, I just want to file something, just to let them know that we're watching, et cetera. And
Well,
so,
I was going to say, they also, if like one constituent, I often will hear a constituent came to me with fill in the blank.
A constituent.
Yeah, a constituent. And then the other point I was going to make is I cover House Ways and Means, which is the body that decides what tax breaks to give out. And it is often one person, one company dealing with one legislator who says, I need a tax break and I will create jobs or, whatever they're going to do. And that bill comes before the legislature and the committee acts and usually passes those kind of tax breaks. So it is very common for it to be just one person or one business or, neighbor or, whoever.
and it's utterly demoralizing in case you're wondering how I feel about it.
James, let me stay with you a second. to talk about the issue of the legislature and transparency. You've been there many, many years. I think all of us would recognize that 20 years or so ago, transparency didn't have a good feeling attached to it there. The sense was always we work more efficiently and better and effectively if we can do it, behind closed doors. And I think in the public rhetoric, that's not a way legislators or politicians talk about things anymore. They definitely trumpet transparency. At the same time, the legislature still is not subject to the open records or open meetings laws. Have you noticed any change in your years there other than the way people talk about transparency? Do things work differently, work more openly, and do you see that? What do you see for the future?
On the surface, there have been changes. For instance, committee meetings are now live streamed. However, I'll go back to the example I have of the Ways and Means Committee. The Ways and Means Committee, the committee itself, when they vote, it's pro forma. The decision's already been made, and they don't hear always from the advocates who are universally lobbyists or corporations or whatever on tax break bills. That's done in a subcommittee meeting, which is not live streamed and which is held in a room about the size of this, and is filled with. I mean, it's hard to even get in the meeting, let alone watch it and cover it. So there are ways around. There are ways that get around. In the 90s, when Speaker Murphy was running the place with Zell Miller and Pierre Howard, Dick Pettis, the AP legend, and I would cover when we covered the budget. They would have conferences where they would talk about in the open what they were kind of debating and what things they were going to do. Now, essentially, it's all behind closed doors. They come out and they say, "Here's the budget. Here you go. Vote yes or no." And they give legislators sometimes an hour to read it. And legislators just go through and they find whatever bond construction project is in their district, and they're saying, thumbs up. So I think there have been improvements, and you're right. You can't say no, we're not going to do anything in the open anymore. But a good example of how things haven't changed in some ways was the reaction that came from the audits on the film tax credit. The film tax credit is seen as the greatest thing ever in the state, next to the lottery maybe, Hope Scholarship, and so it is lauded. Everyone talks about how great it is. So this film tax credit, the first audit, which I found more interesting because I'm a nerd, was on the administration of it and talked about how it's hard to not read that and go, my gosh, what are we're giving away a lot of money that we shouldn't be. It was about how companies kind of circumvent the law to get as much tax money as possible. And this is the amount of money that was spent on the film tax credit. If it were a state agency, it would be the 7th biggest state agency in state government. So in other words, like GBI, State Patrol, all those spend way less than we spend on the film tax credit. So it's a big deal. It's more than the cost of giving the $5,000 a pay raise to teachers, as an example. So it's a really big deal. But the reaction was there was like a industry almost that came out, to discredit this audit. Now, I'm not saying the audit was perfect. It may have, had many problems with it. But I mean, that was kind of the reaction you got, is that whenever there's an audit that's critical, particularly of a tax break, the reaction is, well, the auditors are wrong. We don't really need to know about kind of the bottom line.
Any reaction to those issues from anybody?
So for me, what was interesting about that is, so we passed a bill last year that basically would have allowed kind of almost an ROI analysis, a return on investment analysis of all the tax credits and breaks we give, or at least a portion of them, a good
We
chunk
were
of
allowed
them.
to select them.
Yeah. But at least it's something, right?
Right.
And Kemp, he vetoed that, which I thought was, I was like, I don't even understand that. And then for them, this audit to come out very specifically as to the film tax credit. And so my first question was, well, who asked for this, right? And why is it only on one industry? And when I started asking, I was told, well, we don't know. I'm like, come on, y'all. Like, the audit department doesn't just wake up one day and say, we're going to audit the most popular tax credit in Georgia. I mean, but it was that kind of, it's like there's this seeming transparency. And then when you actually try to dig into it, like, because I was like, well, so is Governor Kemp trying to make a statement? Is he going after this particular industry?
Well, there's a truism in auditing over the 30 years that I've learned is that if an audit comes out at the end of October, November, or December, or early January, it is because there's going to be legislation, or there's going to be they're going to be looked at, or if it comes out earlier in the year, doesn't necessarily mean if it comes out in June or something, it's usually forgotten by January when the legislature comes in. But if it comes out like this one in January, there's a reason.
So I'm going to use this very briefly, hopefully, as an opportunity to pitch you my grand theory of media and politics, which is basically that every interaction between a politician and the media is a trade, where the media gets access to more information than they had before, and the politician gets name ID and the opportunity to punch an opponent. And you essentially, as a politician, so I'll give you a great example. During the session, I got really mad as a human being. Imagine that, not just as a politician, that one of our chaplains in the morning, which by the way, we have prayers every morning at the House of Representatives, and there's sectarian prayers that explicitly call out specific deities. And one of these prayers said that 70% of Georgians were going to hell. And I thought, based on a NARAL poll that had been conducted the Friday before, that it was connected to support for abortion in Georgia. So I was upset and I said something about it. And it got covered by the media. And this was not something I asked for. I didn't go out and ask a reporter, hey, could you please amplify this for me? It happened. And the next morning, even Republicans, so I'm a Democrat, right? Republicans on the House floor who disagreed with my premise came up to me like, hey, nice hit, freshman, high five. and people were genuinely celebrating it on my behalf as somebody who could relate to me in my role as a politician, right? And so the idea of a hit, and you'll hear that, a media hit, nice hit, because that's what the politician gets out of it. So even going back to this stereogenics hearing that we had, and every person in the room, they're not really having a conversation with each other. They all take their opportunity to push their button on the microphone and say, here's what I really want from the department. And that's what I want. I think my constituents want to see that.
Transparency. How can we work with you? I was like, is anybody going to say, why are you still here? You didn't do your job? I mean, I felt the same way, Josh.
Right.
It was bizarre.
And so it's, when it comes to an audit, I think you have to look at it through that lens, like the film tax credit. If you can't derive a simple, understandable message from the story, then you're not going to have that trade, right? And so when people just stonewall and say, the audit doesn't say that, right? They're counting on your inability to derive a simple, understandable, communicable message that disagrees with that premise, right? So all this fake news stuff, sorry to say that phrase in here, but the national level just denying that the truth is happening, it's a wager that what the politician is getting out of it, the name ID, the punch, the support, is not going to be compromised by taking that position and feeding that specific information. So it's once you see it's a very cynical lens, but once you see things that way, again, I'm trying to pitch this to you, it opens up, I think, more explanation as to why certain things happen in politics that otherwise would seem totally not understandable.
And Peter, I have one thought, which is there is actually a legislative success story that runs from essentially the entry of Hollywood into Georgia all the way to stereogenics, and that really is the anti-SLAPP statute. When movie making became a big industry in Georgia, a lot of the movie industry made a significant effort to improve our SLAPP statute. And that legislative effort succeeded. We have a stronger SLAPP statute as a result of it. And one of the manifestations of that was, I believe, the success of the media in reporting on the stereogenics matter. Stereogenics, like a lot of large corporations, when they are in the center of a media firestorm, lawyered up very quickly. And at the beginning of the stereogenics reporting was aggressive with the media in threatening various claims. That subsided pretty quickly. And I think one of the reasons it subsided, and one of the reasons the media was able to pursue the story with the detail and the depth that it did, was because Georgia now has a very effective SLAPP statute passed several years ago that gives the media the ability to push back hard if claims are threatened against it or made against media institutions in an effective and efficient way. And that's one of the things that facilitated the stereogenics reporting. So it is an example of there are certainly bills like the Ethics in Journalism Act that are a threat. We've also had some success stories over the past few years that have benefited reporting in Georgia.
Tom, are there any bills you're following now that you'd put in that category or in the negative category that we haven't talked about?
Sure. So, I mean, the one thing that I'll turn to some other bills, but I do want to mention the Ethics in Journalism bill is a concern, and I'll just explain just to make sure the audience understands what it does. Essentially, the Ethics in Journalism bill, if it were to pass, would mean that the state of Georgia, our government institutions, would impanel a group of experts that would then sit over the media in Georgia and force the media essentially to follow journalism standards that have been articulated by this government institution. Not surprisingly, that is seen as patently unconstitutional, a violation of First Amendment rights. And I do think it's unlikely to pass in this form. The concern about bills like this is it creates a vehicle where legislators get an opportunity to express their frustration, and frequently late in the session, those kind of bills get radically changed. Even if they don't pass by crossover date, they get attached to another bill that has passed through crossover day in the last few days of the session, and end up, in some cases, doing a lot of harm to First Amendment interests. So it is a bill that we will continue to watch closely, and hopefully everybody in the audience will continue to pay attention to. There are other bills that are a concern. An example of one of those bills is Senate Bill 69, which is a bill that would require all party consent for audio recording in the state of Georgia. That would be a radical change from the existing law in this state and from the law in most states across the union. The tradition in this country is that one party in a conversation has the right to make a recording of that conversation, has the right to make an accurate record of what got said to them. And that tool, that law has facilitated the emergence of smartphones to be a powerful device in making sure we're making accurate records of what gets said. And when those records are newsworthy, allowing the media to show accurately what got said from one person to another. That ability to record conversations has had a profound impact in terms of the public truly understanding what gets said by politicians. It's had a profound impact in showing in the ability of litigants to show how they've been harmed, how discrimination has taken place in the workplace. And so it would be really unfortunate if the state moved to a situation where recording something that was said to you, it became illegal to make that recording. And so we watched that bill. I think it would be harmful to essentially transparency
Tom,
generally.
I think we had, Senator Jordan had
Sure.
a comment on
So
that.
so he's talking about this bill, and it sounds bad, right? And it is. But when we talk about a single incident triggering
that's
the
right.
filing of the bill, this really came after Casey Cagle was filmed or recorded by his opponent, Mr. Tippins. And so members of the Senate who were supporters of Cagle introduced this bill last year because they are terrified that they are being recorded now. And this really was in response to that and would have made what Mr. Tippins did illegal.
Exactly.
And we might have had a different governor.
We would have had a different governor.
And on the more favorable side, and hopefully James will speak to this, he wrote a little bit about it in today's newspaper, truth in fees legislation made a little bit of headway last session, and hopefully it'll make more headway this session. That is legislation I think we all have become accustomed to when we're buying tires or when we're making other government, when we're purchasing other goods. Sometimes the government has a specific fee attached to it that frequently is for a purpose that we all agree is a good and positive purpose. And so we're assuming that payment, that small payment, actually goes to that positive government purpose. In fact, for years, it's just gone back into the general funds of the state, and only small portions of it, if at all, have been allocated. Jay Powell, unfortunately, a deceased member of the General Assembly, has for years advocated that there should be truth in that process, that when we pay a specified fee, it should actually go to that purpose. For years, his bill did not make any headway. It made some headway last year, and I hope the legislature will pick it up this year.
Right. I'm old enough to have covered when they created the two big environmental funds to clean up tire dumps and hazardous waste sites in the early 90s. And Georgians are essentially told that they were going to pay these fees. And these are not the only ones. There's also one for driver's license. There's one for training for police training, and there's several other ones. But they essentially create funds and say, we're going to charge you a fee, we're going to tack something onto your bill to pay for these. And through about 2002, the funding actually did go to those trust funds. And then I guess it was the dot-com or 9/11 recession, I forgot which one. Governor Perdue took over and we had financial issues. So essentially, they took that money and, plug holes in the budget. And so I think I've been writing about this for like 15 years, but it seems like, there's a proposed constitutional amendment. They've been proposed several times that has passed the House at least twice, I think, that would essentially allow the General Assembly to dedicate
Use
funds.
that money.
Yeah, force it to go for that. The Senate has traditionally not been favorable to that, largely because Senate Appropriations Chairman Hill has said the government wants the flexibility in case there's a problem to use the money for something else, which is kind of how this whole situation started. So the Senate last year passed a constitutional proposal, and they just haven't worked out the details. So it could still come up this year.
We've got a little over 10 minutes left, so I want to make sure we have some time to try and deal with any questions. Are there any that anyone has right now? Way in the back.
HB 550.
HB what?
550.
550.
As we all pull up Google.
Can you tell us what that bill's about?
Decriminalization of cannabis possessions for the state of Georgia.
For what? I'm sorry.
Decriminalization of,
Also process of fingerprints, as well as the records. I'm sorry, I wrote down another thing, but do you have any feedback?
Sure. I sit on a judiciary non-civil committee that, with its current composition, will not pass that bill. What I would say is,
and could you tell us a little more about what you know about the bill?
well, I don't know a whole lot about this specific bill, but attempts to decriminalize marijuana are not going to go very far, at least in the House Judiciary Non-Civil Committee right now. We just had a conversation as the entire General Assembly in 2019 about low THC oil for medical uses, which, if you knew the state of the law before that, it was technically legal to possess. You just couldn't get it anywhere because nobody was allowed to produce it. You couldn't cross state lines with it, right? So the House originated a bill allowing producers, a certain number of producers, to get licenses to start manufacturing it, right? And that was a huge deal. That was a big conversation that was years in the making. It was only for medical purposes. It was only the oil products, right? And it wasn't, kind of the standard recreational, what we think about when we talk about decriminalizing cannabis. So one of the issues that I think will make it really tough is you've got a bunch of different constituencies who want different things out of this issue and this process. Folks in my caucus really want to see retroactive justice to make sure that if we do a kind of like a full legalization, that the people aren't going to get left behind. People who are historically subject to the criminal justice process in some way related to cannabis, that those people have as complete of restoration of their rights and what was taken from them as possible. Also, seeing diversity in the economic aspect of it, making sure that businesses that produce or are able to sell cannabis aren't exclusively owned by white people who didn't face the same criminal justice consequences historically, right? So and that's just the Democratic side of it, right? And you might see us vote against legalization efforts that don't include some of these basic measures. So that, let alone the diversity of opinion in the Republican Party about the morality of it or, what the economics of it are. So I would just say, to give you an answer broadly about cannabis, I think we're a few years away from anything as sweeping as that.
Any additional thoughts on that?
I also think that as long as law enforcement say it's bad, you're not going to pass it. I mean, the reality is that they fought medical marijuana for a long time because under the theory that medical marijuana, it was like the gateway drug. Medical marijuana was going to lead to all these, this criminal activity. Obviously, hasn't happened, but as long as law enforcement is coming before the legislature and saying this is a bad thing, I don't think you're going to pass it.
But you may have some countervailing if we need more revenue. I mean, we've said gambling was really bad for a really long time. All of a sudden, we need money. So it's one of those things. I know one of the arguments made in support of cannabis, hemp, whatever, was that just legalize it so then we can tax it. So you may start to see some of those arguments come up on the Republican side. I mean, Democrats have a different approach, but that may be the thing that actually results in legislation. But I'm with Josh. It's going to be.
I can't wait to see the inflation, though, and how much the state would gain, because you're seeing that now with gambling issues. Right. In budget parlance, we say numbers are fungible. They'll if they need X amount of dollars, they'll come up with it one way or another. I'll be interested to see. They'll start. I think it was sports betting. Sports betting hasn't made a lot of money for governments around the country, but I was talking to a big proponent, and it's now up to $150 million the state would get from sports betting, and I'm sure it'll be 300 by the time they actually take the bill up.
Is some form of gambling going to pass this session?
I'm getting lobbyist emails from the NBA now, you know? I mean, it's, the conversation has started. I mean, we actually had an explicit admonishment from our House leadership, or minority leadership, that we should watch out this session for getting explicit offers from large organizations to line our pockets somehow in exchange for a vote on gambling. And my response was, you're concerned about campaign contributions? He goes, no, I'm concerned about people bribing you. And if that happens, you call the GBI. I mean, that's how salient this conversation has become this session, is that there's a real concern that this whole industry, seeing an opportunity, is just going to kind of swoop in on unsuspecting Georgia legislators and get their will done. And I haven't seen anything quite that scary yet, but it's good to be prepared.
Look, we're desperate. Go ahead.
And if gambling comes to Georgia, one of the things that will be important is that we try and make sure that it's operating in a way that's reasonably transparent in terms of the benefits it brings back to Georgia. Because right now, the organization in the state of Georgia that is most protected from any kind of public transparency is the Georgia Lottery. Everything about the Georgia Lottery, everything they do, how they operate, it's all protected from public scrutiny. And if that same model gets perpetuated into sports betting or other forms of gambling in the state of Georgia, we will never be able to tell what kind of benefits or lack of benefits it really brings.
The lottery director spoke to the House and Senate Appropriations Committee, and she actually thanked them for passing the law that said she didn't have to say who won. You know, they passed a law that said if you win the lottery, they no longer have to, say who you are or give any information about it. And she actually publicly thanked them. And I thought, what an ironic thing the day before the First Amendment, foundation breakfast.
Any question, Ken?
A question for our two legislators. Do you think there is any opportunity for legislative oversight of how state agencies do? We have very strong laws in Georgia respecting records. The problem is they're not enforced.
At all.
And many state agencies, James referred to one, the Department of Public Health, that not only would not speak to our
Community health.
but did not provide records for months and months and months and months. So my question is there a way that maybe your committee representative might hold hearings or, bring people to account as a way to put some pressure and some scrutiny on people who are paid by us to comply with the laws that we have on the books?
Well, the problem is this conflict issue, right? That the AG is forced to wear two conflicting hats, right? That they're supposed to prosecute and also defend the agency. So, I guess, we could hire Bob Mueller. You know what I mean? Like, we'd probably have to have some sort of an independent.
No, but I think more specifically to your point, look, as a state legislature, I use Open Records Act requests all the time. I never make a request in my official capacity because I'm not going to get a response. I send ORRs coming and going. And I have seen such a different, every agency, every department handles it differently. It literally, I think at EPD, they'll send out an email saying, we got this ORR, does anybody have anything responsive? I mean, there's like no set guidelines in terms of how do you respond, who's in charge of it, kind of the shepherding of the process, I think is a huge issue. The problem is that each agency, each department can basically just do what they want. And then, as Josh was saying, they're never held to account. I mean, everybody knows about the prosecution of Mayor Reed's aide recently by the AG. The AG, you're not going to see that with respect to him coming after a government, like a state agency. Absolutely, absolutely.
We could, but as you said, I mean, the laws are there. And so the issue is enforcement. I mean, I think some sort of independent ombudsman model would make sense, just dedicated to this purpose. But I don't know exactly what it would look like.
There was an example in when the governor's office told agencies they had to cut their budgets. I sent an open records request to UGA because one of the one of the cuts that really caused a lot of consternation among rural legislators were cuts to the ag extension service. And had been talking to people who worked there who were very concerned about layoffs and this kind of stuff. And so I sent the request, I think, middle of September, maybe early September, and their response was that they, to my open request, which was essentially for emails between the people who are making these decisions, was that I would get them in late December. And right before the legislature, I was going to get something that they had, so you're right.
I think we've got time for at least one more question.
Yeah, can we go back to the question of expungement and people who are maybe arrested and getting their records sealed? What extent does it even matter if things can be expunged or sealed if these records exist on Google? If you got arrested once and it got on Google somehow, you're not going to erase it from Google.
Well, I think the information, at least according to my understanding, continues to exist and that law enforcement has access to it. So even if it's, if it's taken out of the public purview, law enforcement officers would still have access. So you're right, it doesn't go away, but I mean, that's kind of an interesting problem.
But I guess it still ruins the person's life as long as it's on Google, no matter how much records may get sealed from the government side.
Despite everything, I still kind of believe in norms. And I say that hopefully with some sense of optimism and humor, right? And I think that even if an employer, when I live in an apartment. When I go to my apartment manager and I say, I would like to do X, Y, Z, they don't really care. They're not, can somebody come repair this? I've been costing you a lot in repairs recently. They're not sending a message up to the corporate office that says, this guy's really starting to become a problem. We should think about not renewing his lease. You know what I mean? It's not that big brother. And so I think there's a formality to the process of requesting the background check, in terms of corporate policy when it comes to employers, housing, different opportunities like that, that if you can clean up the GCIC record for somebody, I do think that has real effects. Even if you could go on a wild goose chase Googling them, I'm not that nihilistic about the effect of record restriction. I think it would still do a lot for people who are going through those somewhat formal processes that are ensconced in each corporation.
And as a practical matter, it does have an impact. And so when something's removed from GCIC, now the private data institutions that track criminal records are generally complying with that expungement. And so if it's removed from GCIC and the NCIC, then they remove it from their records as well. So expungement genuinely does expunge criminal activity. It's only going to be available on Google if, frankly, a media organization published a story about it. And so that criminal activity had to have risen to an extremely high level so that it was newsworthy enough for a news organization to say, we want our citizens to be aware of it. And even now, certainly all the news leadership in the room will be painfully aware of news organizations routinely now get requests to remove their past stories from their archives, and because the record has been expunged. And that's a challenge for the news organizations. All the news organizations are trying to, as Senator Jordan said, balance the two issues. There's an understanding that some people, for minor crimes, that there's a legitimate interest in letting them move forward with their lives. When that story got written, it was not anticipated that it would live forever on an internet that didn't even exist at that time. Side by side with that, for individuals that are involved in government, that individuals that are involved in childcare, there's also an interest in protecting the first draft of history that reported on events as they occurred. So it's a struggle for news organizations too.
Well, that brings us to 9 o'clock, so I hope you'll join me in thanking our sponsors and our panel. And thank you all for being here today.